Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. We are told in this very Trinitarian Gospel of St. John that the Father judges no one. He has entrusted all judgment to the Son, so that all may honour the Son as they honour the Father. Whoever refuses honour to the Son refuses honour to the Father who sent him. We know that in the case, for instance, of a priest who dies, one of the issues on which he is judged directly is the way that he has handled the Lord. The way we handle the Blessed Sacrament is the way we're handling the presence, and the presence also is the presence of the Father, for we cannot separate the members of the Trinity. Therefore, to handle lightly the Blessed Sacrament is to be up against all the power of the universe, and therefore the judgment is bound to be severe. The Son, we are told, has been given this role of being the supreme judge. The Father has handed over all judgment to the Son. This same author, John, gives us also the Apocalypse, in which he is called the first and the last, the Alpha and the Omega, therefore the last word. And no matter how much noise we make even against our God, the last word is not on this side of time. And the Lord is patient. He does not feel obliged, as we would humanly, to react immediately and loudly and to play the same game. He lets people abuse the power that they have from him, even to throw it in his face. The great technology of man can go either way. The talents of men can go either way. But the last word is not on this stage. So the Lord is calm and quiet, that quiet dignity which is a lesson also unto us. We don't have to reply each time. There is more power sometimes in a dignified silence than in an equally noisy reaction, where we are brought down to the level of the person who often doesn't know what he's doing. But some people do know what they're doing and deliberately do certain things. When it comes to people seemingly deliberately using what they have in their power to make fun of what they're bound to be aware of as the supreme power, that in public, then one cringes, because that same silent dignity is awaiting them, and God is not mocked. When it comes to ourselves, we have no right to judge. To judge God is the supreme injustice. A creature can't complain, can't criticize the king. But also to judge each other is to presume that we know more than we do. The Son is also in his humanity on our side and is for us, not against us. He undertook our humanity so as to save us out of compassion, the divine mercy. And therefore he is well placed to be our judge, because he is our advocate, knowing our weakness. But we can't say the same thing of ourselves, and yet we do. If one looks at a high proportion of our conversation on this planet, it is to do with judgment. Gossip goes into judgment. At a time like this weekend, when St. Patrick is feasted with much Guinness, much conversation will inevitably go in the pubs of Ireland into that. Talk which is actually damaging. And because God is listening and eventually judging, this talk is not just vibration of molecules. It is indelible ink on our copybook to face us one day when we die and have stopped talking. Because in that silence of the grave there is that final word over which we have no power. We have written, and then we must read and reap what we have written forevermore, irreversibly in time. With regard to the correct way of handling each other, it can be summed up in an old French saying, tout savoir, c'est tout pardonner. To know all is to pardon all. And that means to say that we do not know quite often what makes a person do certain things, whereas God does and therefore is equitable in his judgment. We are not, because we only see the tip of the iceberg. There are always complicated, complex, sometimes contradictory factors in a person's comportment. God knows and understands each one. We do not. So we zoom into the end product without having a clue about what is behind it or underneath it. Therefore, the true attitude of the creature is to realize that he is a creature and therefore observes calmly and in a certain way, in a non-attached way, detached from reaction, that is, objectively what is going on, and somehow with the eyes of God trying to acquire the gift of discernment and even knowledge with regard to the factors within. It is what happens in the case of both a psychologist and a priest, spending time listening and therefore analysing and detecting probably this is the reason for that. And these people tendentially do not do all the talking, because when a person is talking, he is actually betraying himself, and therefore one lets the person betray himself as much as possible, and then one sees a bit more each time. Observing then is not judging, it is seeing the illness, the cause, and diagnosing what is actually wrong profoundly. I conclude, confession is on that level of healing, listening, and getting to a diagnosis, but it also has the element of judgment. For in canon law and in church history, the sacrament of confession doesn't work like the other sacraments, because, and that's why a priest who is ordained hasn't got the faculty to confess until he's given it by the bishop, because it's a separate issue. It involves a delegated authority to do what only in the early church the bishop would do. He would act as judge. The bishops in the early church were also judges, and this penitential sphere was a part of their judgment, that they had to pronounce judgment with regard to yes or no, reconciliation and so on, and also the penalty. The whole system was very complex in the early church, but therefore delegating that to someone else progressively as time has gone on more and more has still its origin in that sense of actually pronouncing judgment. One is a judge in the forum of confession. I just conclude. Last week we were in Italy, because people was coming back to Italy every Lent, and we were hearing confessions and other things as well. But for a while I sat in an old box which I would be using before, and it was one of the classic boxes still there in Italy, and I noticed on the top of it, the old wood there, it had the date when it was made. It was 1695, and it was still being used. And opposite there was another one on the other side of the church still being used, and in there was still an old list written actually in the handwriting of the by now deceased prior. When he was a young priest, he'd written the reserved sins for that diocese. When he was ordained, there were about 6 of them, and that again was a reminder that all these souls who have come and gone into these boxes over the ages have come into that forum of divine judgment, and on this side of time getting healed before they face that last word. Also, any confession heard with the authority of the church has the same effect. Even the stole that a priest carries in his pocket is used in all kinds of circumstances and places, the sick and so on. And each time that same power is passing and one sees its effect. Many young people who have come in perhaps from a different situation, classically in very big trouble sometimes, serious trouble, but because of the situation we're in Italy, we were handling them a lot. And one saw great healing and often tears coming into the use of these instruments of grace. All that to say that God is not against us at all, but we have to, in some way, when we come to Him, be our own judge first of all. And if we have any business at all, it should be starting with ourselves, not judging us, but observing ourselves, and therefore observing our reality. Because if we know ourselves, we are somewhat less inclined to presume the ability to judge other people, because we are the worst of all, partly because we have received so much and corresponded so little. Actually, I have here something I wrote on an old confessional in Italy. I think it was the one that Dom Clementino had kept there. He was restoring the church near our monastery, and he'd kept the old confessional because of, he said, the fact that it had heard all the sins of the centuries. So he kept it in the church to be used still. I was quite moved when I saw it. How many sins have crossed this little grill that stands aloft, alone, between heaven and hell? How oft was blood that on this cross lies still, shed on a gaping chasm, ere a knell o'er blasted aeons rang. How oft did he through these weak pores soft pass and cancel all that could the demons sate in damned glee, at what was not revoked in moments small. Great elegance is not in this wee box that holds the skies at large, yet charged is this, each splinter and each crack, and all hell rocks with irritation strong at swindled bliss that had no right to be, that should not be. For such dry rot dries not eternity. Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. The old confessional. How many sins have crossed this little grill that stands aloft, alone, between heaven and hell? How oft was blood that on this cross lies still, shed on a gaping chasm, ere a knell o'er blasted aeons rang. How oft did he through these weak pores soft pass and cancel all that could the demons sate in damned glee at what was not revoked in moments small. Great elegance is not in this wee box that holds the skies at large, yet charged is this, each splinter and each crack, and all hell rocks with irritation strong at swindled bliss, that had no right to be, that should not be, for such dry rot dries not eternity.